When the Personal Data Protection Law goes into effect next year, companies in Saudi Arabia will have to identify and define their purposes for collecting personal data. The Personal Data Protection Law establishes the need for companies to specify their purposes for collecting personal data in the rights of personal data owners, the requirements placed on the use of personal data, and obligations placed on companies that collect and use personal data. The Personal Data Protection Law gives individuals the right to be told how their personal data will be used and requires their consent to the processing purposes. It also prohibits companies from using personal data for any reason other than the purposes for which it was collected. For example, a company that collects personal data from applicants for employment purposes may not use the same personal data for marketing purposes. The Personal Data Protection Law requires companies to adopt a personal data privacy policy that includes the purposes for collecting personal data, notify personal data owners of the purposes for collecting their personal data before collection, and keep records of their personal data processing activities that include the purposes for processing personal data. The collection purpose must be lawful and directly related to the business objectives of the company collecting it. For example, companies that provide healthcare services need health and other sensitive data to provide healthcare services to their patients. Likewise, financial service providers require credit data and other sensitive data to provide financial services to their clients and customers. The content of personal data collected must be appropriate and limited to the minimum amount necessary to achieve the collection purpose, and it must be destroyed as soon as its purpose for collection have been completed. The Personal Data Protection Law also imposes specific requirements on processing for promotional or awareness purposes, marketing purposes, and scientific research or statistical purposes. To define the purposes for processing personal data, companies in Saudi Arabia should start evaluating how their use of personal data relates to their business purposes and objectives. The Personal Data Protection Law requires companies to only use personal data that is necessary to achieve specified purposes and objectives. For example, companies that provide healthcare services and financial services need to use personal data to provide healthcare and financial services to their patients, clients, and customers. Even companies that are not service-based require personal data to achieve their purposes and objectives. For example, the recruitment, hiring, and administration of employees require the collection and processing of personal data for the purposes of identifying, screening, assessing, and selecting applicants for employment, relocating or mobilizing applicants into the workforce, creating employment agreements and distributing salaries, managing work schedules and advancement, administering health and personnel benefits, and complying with other governmental requirements. Companies that operate secure facilities may require personal data for security and visitor management purposes. Companies may also require personal data to manage their supplier relationships, to engage in public relations activities, and for cybersecurity purposes. Companies should also identify whether they need to process personal data for promotional or awareness purposes, marketing purposes, or scientific research or statistical purposes. Companies that can identify and define their purposes for collecting and processing personal data today will be able to determine the minimum amount of personal data required for their purposes and establish the personal data collection, processing, and destruction procedures that the Personal Data Protection Law will require. EMME, supporting emerging markets and the Middle East.